consequences for that. Because Canada is not the socialist utopia that a lot of people think, and I don't mean to say this as a criticism of the government in general, but just to remember that the two dominant groups in Canada, the Anglos of Ontario and the Quebecois of Quebec, are broadly pro-immigrant, but they're broadly anti each other. So an immigration policy that is culture-driven can only take you so far if you have unresolved cultural issues in your own country. Because of that, most of the immigrants that come into Canada don't really assimilate very well. They form enclaves. So you have your little Afghanistan, your little India, your little China, and so on. That's not a deal killer, but it does mean that it's a very different feel from what you have in the United States when it comes to migrants. The second problem is that because those people who are coming in are so much older, financially and economically, it puts Canada on a bit of a treadmill. They have to have these flows every single year because the, quote, native, unquote, population, to use an incredibly loaded term, has a birth rate that's so low that without lots and heavy inward migration, the Canadian system just simply seizes up. So they need those people coming in to work and to pay taxes. And if anything happens to it, then you have some real problems. Well, something is happening to it. The nature of the migration has evolved, and it's gotten to the point that you're getting relatively wealthy people coming to Canada, which the Canadians, of course, love, but they're not taking jobs. They're coming in, they're getting residency and even citizenship, they're dropping money, they're buying property, and then they move on. They see Canada not as the city on the hill or a place to escape to, but as a place to park their cash while they live somewhere else. And this has made most Canadian major cities, most notably Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City, made the housing market so distorted that local Canadians, people who were born in Canada, can't really afford to live in their own country. And that has prompted the Trudeau government to amend ownership laws so that as of January 1 of 2023, most foreigners cannot buy most property. That's obviously going to have a negative impact upon the financial transfer and immigration in general, and then all of a sudden Canada has to figure out another way to pay for Canada. One of the problems when you have an inverted demography is you don't have enough young people to do the work. You don't have enough mature workers to pay the taxes. And Canada, just like the Western Europeans, is aging into mass retirement very, very quickly. The way that the Canadians have patched this up to this point is they just tax the tar out of Alberta. But between limitations on export infrastructure, political shifts in Alberta and back in Ottawa, and a general attitude towards carbon that puts a lot of federal restrictions on energy production, and Alberta's probably paid in as much as it possibly can, and it's probably going to actually have a reduction in flows into the center in the not too distant future, assuming no legal challenges, which will definitely happen. Which means Canada, the great success story for using immigration to solve demographic issues, must find a new way to operate, and it must find it in the low single digits of years. In order to solve one problem, the Trudeau government has basically upended the bottle. Us, New Zealand, and the United States, which are really the only two advanced countries that are kind of in a different sort of bucket when it comes to demographics. If you remember some of the earlier work, most demographics are either children heavy, where you've got lots of children and few retirees, or the complete opposite of that, of a lot of retirees and not a lot of children, or something that's more of a chimney where it's in transition. New Zealand and the United States are both transition countries in this regard, but they've got a couple structures within their demographic profiles, I guess is the best word, that put them kind of in a different bucket. Now, most advanced countries have been aging so quickly and for so long that there is no longer even a statistic hope of demographic reconstitution. Once the bulge in your population structure passes about the mid-30s, it's just no longer possible for your population to kick out kids like they're in their 20s anymore, and you're destined to have an inverted demographic structure and all the negatives that go along with that, which we will discuss in the next session. But for the Americans and the Kiwis, they have pulled off something that is nearly unique. And they actually have a large number of young people working their way up through the system. We know them as millennials, and that makes all the difference in the world. Now, there are three big reasons why the Kiwis and the Americans fall into this different category. First of all, they've got a lot of good land, and so they've always been able to maintain a relatively large agricultural and rural population, even in times of rapid industrialization. And as a rule, when you live on the farm, kids are free labor, so you have a whole bunch. So having a chunk of your population that's still on the farm helps your numbers. And when you've got a large amount of agricultural produce to move and it's very reliable, you will also have a network of small towns. Small towns have a lot more elbow room than inner cities. So both the original agricultural zone and then the transition communities into the suburbs, each of those allow higher birth rates than you're going to see in urban cores. And the Kiwis and the Americans have these populations everywhere. Second, both the United States and New Zealand are what we call settler societies, which is a way of saying that the dominant ethnicity or ethnicities really aren't from there. And that means they tend to be more politically open to the concept of immigration. Now, that openness is relative and it ebbs and it flows, but this isn't France, this isn't Germany, this isn't Japan or China, where if you're not of the dominant ethnicity, you're a second-class citizen. There is a way into that dominant ethnicity, and immigration takes advantage of that. And then third, both New Zealand and the United States are open societies politically with great internal mobility options. So it's very easy for people to move from one part of the country to another that might be experiencing lower standards of living or higher income growth. And as long as that is going, it makes it easier for people to have children in the first place because the numbers for them make sense. This isn't Germany where everything's kind of locked together and there's no place to move for elbow room. This isn't China where you have to get a permit if you want to shift cities. People can make the decisions for their own, and that means you don't have to wait for 2, 5, 10 years to decide to have a child. You can just do it whenever your own schedule meets it. And these two countries have had all three of these trends going for decades since their formation. That all keeps birth rates higher, and it keeps their population structures firmly in that chimney phase rather than simply aging into full inverted pyramids. That means that the primary demographic characteristic of both of these countries isn't so much that there's a bunch of baby boomers on the verge of mass retirement, although there is, and that is a problem, but instead that they've got a temporary hiccup in their demographics that are just in front of them. Because for them, only for them, the baby boomers had kids, we know them as millennials, and in between we've got a narrow point, the Xers. And the specific characteristic that is going to be driving the demographic, economic, and political decision making of these two countries for the next decade or two is going to be that Xer cut. Now, the Xer cut is because you've got a whole bunch of boomers, very few Xers, and then a whole bunch of millennials. And as these generations move up and through the system, they shape economic trends in different ways. So for example, the baby boomers have been in their 50s and their early 60s for a while. They're now massing into retirement. But until they hit retirement, they're skill rich and they're capital rich. So they've kept American worker productivity high, American tax rates high, and investment capital cheap because they're generating so much of it. When Gen X now moves in to become the mature worker generation, there aren't enough of them to fill all the jobs, and there aren't enough of them to pay all the capital. So throughout the late 2020s in particular, life for the Americans and the Kiwis is going to get rough. The boomers have been capital rich, but now they're majority retired and they're absorbing capital in the form of healthcare and pensions. The millennials are in their prime consuming years and they need to borrow.